I think what we really need to do is to set a context for the book and the project. And historically, where does the Seaway project come from? We've got Canada in the United States.
Yes.
How long did they envision doing something with the Seaway?
Well, in terms of politically doing something, it started at the turn of the 20th century. And in my book, and a lot of other historians have commented, the U.S. and Canada probably would have built this project earlier, but several major global events, including World War I and the Great Depression, World War II, got in the way. But the idea always was that you needed to have a waterway that connected the Atlantic Ocean to the interior of Canada and to the Great Lakes to promote manufacturing, to promote transportation. And it just happened that based on decades of debates, even Franklin Roosevelt was a big proponent of it, that all of the necessary components came together in the 1950s. One was the Cold War and the need of the U.S. to have extra power, and that's when the power component, the power dam, became important. There also was a need for a transportation route in America's minds in case of war, and also the case of rebuilding Europe. So it was a process of over 50 years that was interrupted several times, but the plans for it pretty much stayed the same, that it would always be a waterway, a navigational project, as well as a power dam project.
So there's two phases. Mm-hmm. Transportation, power, sure. And what I think a lot of us just don't have on the forefront of our minds is that the Canadian and American border, United States border, runs all the way through this.
It does.
And as it does through most of the Great Lakes. I mean, on the other side, there's, across from Detroit, there's Windsor.
Yes.
And the Welland Canal and how important all this is, and the Erie Canal. So this is another project that ties in with an already evolved transportation process and political process.
It does, and I think the unique part about this one is that the power dam component of it was half built by the United States, half built by the Canadians, and it meets in the middle at the international border. And it's built completely differently, completely different concrete pours. The turbines turn in different ways. But it's one of the projects, I think, globally in history, where two countries actually built something together like that.
Rather than negotiating, I'll do this part totally, you do that part totally.
It had to meet in the middle, and they have to function as one power dam, even though they split. There's a powerhouse on each side. So it's probably the only time, I believe, that two countries have worked this way together.
And I assume we're talking two English-speaking countries rather than French and English.
Yeah.
So the plan was formulated 50 years before it got implemented. Sure. What does that do over a period of time?
Well, I think in the 1940s, there was a push in the United States by FDR to build the Seaway as part of the New Deal. He had taken tours of the Tennessee Valley, he had Tennessee Valley Authority, and he thought that at that time, during the New Deal, that this would be a way to employ people. The problem was that he couldn't get the resources once the bombing of Pearl Harbor took place to build this. But the plans themselves were modernized in the 1940s on the American side, but pretty much what you see now is what was designed in the 40s. It was modified as the project was built in the 50s, 6 weeks ahead of the construction workers.
It's like making a movie, it sounds like.
It was, and they would change plans if something didn't work. They would have to redesign it, sometimes on the spot, sometimes tear down things that didn't work and rebuild them. So the concept had been around, but the plans had pretty much stopped in the 40s, and the U.S. did not have time to modify them before they began construction.
That's incredible. So while this is going on, while the construction is going on, was there there's also locks in the river.
Sure, yeah.
So there was already ships going back and forth, but the plan was to make it open.
Well, no, actually, you could still see parts of it. There was a canal, and it still runs in certain places along the side of the waterway. The construction of the Seaway and the power dam and all the locks took place at the same time. They had to manage water flow. They had to use cofferdams to make sure that certain areas were not flooded. But everything happened at the same time, and there were 5 sort of distinct construction sites, but communication, water levels, everything was key to this not being disastrous. And they had 4 years to do it.
Was there any point in the process that the powers that be started to second guess themselves?
Sure.
And say, I don't think we should do this.
Well, they couldn't back out because there's a gentleman by the name of Robert Moses who was the head of the power authority at the time, and he had sold bonds to pay for the power dam. And he also had Niagara Falls in his future. So as people said it, the bulldozer was going to get this done no matter how many people, how many lives it took, or heads would be rolling down the Seaway in the current. So it was going to get done.
Can I ask you how many people were involved and some of the numbers just to get the sense of what an enormous project this was?
Well, there were 22,000 workers total on the Canadian and U.S. side of the project. At one given time, the largest number, a little over 6,000, were working on the power dam aspect of the project for both sides. But it also doesn't take into the equation all of the engineers at the Corps of Engineers that were working out of the Buffalo office, a lot of the contractors that were from Kentucky or Boston. So it involved a lot of other peripheral people that do not get taken into the statistical counts.
Plus all the financiers and the politicians. And I mean, this is another one of those projects, when you think about it, puts people back to work. You know, the phrase, we've got to put people back to work. This really put a lot of people to work.
It did. It took a lot of people who had lived through the Depression, a lot of people who had gotten their college education based on the GI Bills, and were taking their first position in life as junior engineers, sometimes as laborers who needed money to go to college. And it also had a completely new element that a lot of projects didn't have, and that was a local iron worker, steel worker force off of the nearby reservation. So it brought together a whole bunch of people at similar times in their lives and gave them an experience not only in their careers but in their lives.
That's an aspect of the book that I really found fascinating, was the coincidence of how all those small towns became centers for these growing populations of workers, and how that makes a different town.
Yes.
And how that changes people's lives. On the big context itself, you mentioned that this was seen as a way to also help rebuild Europe.
Yes.
How did that factor in? How does that factor in?
Well, the idea was that you needed a transportation route that would be able to take supplies from the Great Lakes out to the Atlantic without having to go back on land. And iron ore resources had been discovered in Canada. This was a time when American manufacturing was really taking off. And so the U.S. saw this as an important component and as a way to get funding by saying, we need to rebuild Europe, we need to get them supplies so that they won't turn to communism again. So this is the way that they put a little bit of fear into Congress, and the Defense Department played a major role in that. They also believed, and they thought that we possibly would have another war. And one of the first ships to go through there were 2 Navy destroyers. It also had the capability back then to have submarines go through there, because there was a fear that there could possibly be another Pearl Harbor. And so we needed an inland waterway in peacetime and an inland waterway during a possible time of conflict.
Yeah, there was always that dual argument, right?
Needed it.
This will work in peacetime, it'll also work in wartime. And it's a good place to hide submarines.